What if I told you there was a time when stepping onto dry land was essentially a death sentence? A period in Earth's history so bizarre that the safest place to be wasn't in your home, not in a shelter, but underwater. Today, we're diving into the most alien chapter of our planet's past, when the very air itself bred monsters, and the land belonged to creatures so terrifying they make your worst nightmares look like bedtime stories. Most of us think of water as dangerous, drowning, sharks, the unknown depths. But there was one extraordinary period when everything we know about survival was flipped upside down. This wasn't some distant fantasy world or science fiction nightmare. This was Earth, our Earth, roughly 300 million years ago, during what scientists call the Carboniferous period. And what happened then will fundamentally change how you think about the world around you. Before we begin this journey into deep time, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're about to hear isn't speculation or theory. Every detail is backed by fossil evidence, geological data, and decades of scientific research. The creatures I'm going to describe actually existed. The landscapes I'll paint for you once covered entire continents. And the atmospheric conditions that made this nightmare possible are preserved in rock layers that we can study today. So settle in, because we're about to explore the only time in Earth's 4.5 billion year history when water truly was safer than land. And by the end of this series, you'll understand why this forgotten age holds the key to some of humanity's deepest, most primal fears. Picture our planet today. When you think about danger, where does your mind go? Maybe it's the ocean, with its hidden predators and crushing depths. Perhaps it's the wilderness, with bears and wolves. But fundamentally, humans have always been land creatures. We built our civilizations on solid ground, sought shelter in caves and forests, and learned to fear the water that could swallow us whole. Now imagine if all of that was reversed. Imagine if the forest floor was so packed with predators that every step risked death. Imagine if the air itself was thick enough to fuel creatures so massive they defied everything we understand about biology. Imagine if the only escape from this living hell was to dive beneath the surface and pray the water would hide you. This is exactly what happened during the Carboniferous period, and it all started with something as simple as the air we breathe. Today, our atmosphere contains about 21% oxygen. That might sound like a random number, but it's actually the perfect balance for life as we know it. Enough oxygen to fuel our muscles and brains, but not so much that everything becomes explosive. During the Carboniferous, however, that delicate balance was shattered. Oxygen levels soared to an incredible 35%, and that single change transformed Earth into an alien world. Why did this happen? The answer lies in the forests themselves. The Carboniferous was a time of incredible plant growth. Massive swamps covered the continents, filled with towering tree ferns and giant club mosses that reached heights of over 100 feet. These weren't the familiar trees we know today, but strange, primitive giants with scaly trunks and feathery crowns that blocked out the sun. These forests were photosynthesis factories, pumping oxygen into the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. But here's the crucial part that most people don't realize. The bacteria and fungi that normally decompose dead plant material hadn't yet evolved the ability to break down woody tissue efficiently. So when these massive trees died, they didn't rot away. Instead, they piled up in the swamps, eventually forming the coal deposits we mine today. Meanwhile, all that trapped carbon meant less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more oxygen building up to dangerous levels. At first glance, you might think this sounds amazing. More oxygen means more energy for living things, right? And you'd be partially correct. But like so many things in nature, there's a dark side to abundance. That extra oxygen didn't just give life more energy. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of what was biologically possible. Here's where things get truly disturbing. Insects don't breathe like we do. They don't have lungs that actively pump air in and out. Instead, they rely on a network of tiny tubes called trachea that allow oxygen to diffuse directly into their tissues. In our modern atmosphere, this system works fine for small creatures, but it places strict limits on how large an insect can grow. There simply isn't enough oxygen to reach the deep tissues of a massive insect body. But in the Carboniferous atmosphere, those limitations vanished. With 35% oxygen saturating the air, these primitive breathing systems could suddenly support creatures of impossible size. Evolution, always ready to exploit new opportunities, responded with enthusiasm. Insects began growing to proportions that would make your skin crawl. Dragonflies, today delicate creatures that skim across ponds, evolved into aerial predators with wingspans as wide as a hawk. These weren't gentle insects admired for their beauty. They were precision hunters with compound eyes made of thousands of lenses, giving them panoramic vision that could track the slightest movement below. Their spiny legs formed deadly baskets that could snatch prey from the air with surgical accuracy. But the skies were just the beginning. On the forest floor, centipedes stretched longer than a grown human, their armored bodies glistening like living tanks as they crawled through the undergrowth. Scorpions grew to the size of house cats, their pincers capable of crushing anything they caught. Their tails arched overhead like spears, dripping with venom. And then there were the spiders. Not the small garden spiders we might find in our homes, but predators large enough to weave webs across entire trees. These weren't delicate webs designed to catch flies. They were massive nets strong enough to trap small vertebrates, with silk that was literally stronger than steel by weight. Think about that for a moment. Every shadow could hide a scorpion the size of a cat. Every tree could be strung with webs designed to catch animals as large as you. Every clearing could be patrolled by dragonflies, with the hunting skills of raptors and the wingspan of eagles. This was the world that the first vertebrates encountered when they began leaving the water. And here's where our story takes its most crucial turn. Because while these monstrous arthropods ruled every inch of land, the same atmospheric conditions that made them possible had limits. Water, it turns out, was the one environment that couldn't support gigantism to the same degree. The physics are simple, but crucial. Oxygen diffuses much more slowly through water than through air. For creatures that relied on gills or primitive lungs, there was a natural ceiling to how large they could become in an aquatic environment. The oceans and rivers were filled with predators, yes, but none reached the overwhelming scale of the land arthropods. This created a bizarre inversion of safety. On land, every surface teemed with oversized predators. Giant millipedes coiled through the underbrush like living logs. Massive insects patrolled the canopy. The air itself buzzed with the wings of creatures that could pluck you from the ground without warning, but slip beneath the surface of a river or lake. And suddenly, the rules changed. Here, predators were bound by different limitations. A fish might be dangerous, but it was dangerous in ways that a small amphibian could understand and potentially escape. There were no dragonflies the size of hawks swooping through the water, no centipedes longer than a human coiled through the depths. For the pioneering amphibians, those first vertebrates brave enough to explore land, water became their lifeline. These creatures were caught between two worlds, with bodies halfway between fish and reptile. They had sturdy limbs instead of fins, lungs that could process the oxygen-rich air, but skin that still demanded constant moisture. They were evolutionary pioneers, but they were also incredibly vulnerable. Every journey onto land was a calculated risk. The terrestrial environment offered opportunities that didn't exist in the water. There were new food sources, unoccupied niches, and the chance to exploit resources that no vertebrate had ever claimed. But reaching those opportunities meant running a gauntlet of predators that had been evolving for millions of years to dominate every corner of the landscape. Picture one of these early amphibians pulling itself from the shallows onto the muddy bank of a Carboniferous swamp. Its movements are clumsy and awkward, sending vibrations through the soft earth. Above, the canopy blocks most sunlight, casting the ground in perpetual twilight. The air is thick and humid, carrying the heavy scent of rotting vegetation and something else, something that suggests danger lurking just out of sight. Every step is a gamble. A wrong move could send it stumbling into the path of a giant scorpion waiting in the shadows. A pause too long might give away its position to a spider monitoring vibrations in its web. Even breathing becomes dangerous as the thick air threatens to dry out skin that evolved underwater. And yet, despite these overwhelming dangers, the amphibians kept trying. Generation after generation ventured onto land, each one testing the limits of what was possible. Some found brief moments of success, discovering patches of safety or sources of food that made the risk worthwhile. Others became meals for the arthropod giants that ruled this alien landscape. But here's what makes this story so remarkable. Those early amphibians, fragile and vulnerable as they were, carried within them the seeds of a revolution that would eventually overturn the entire balance of power on Earth. They just didn't know it yet. What they did know was that when the dangers of land became too overwhelming, when the predators closed in and survival seemed impossible, they always had one refuge. The water that had birthed them remained their sanctuary, the one environment where the monsters of the Carboniferous couldn't follow. This extraordinary period in Earth's history lasted for millions of years, but like all ages, it would eventually come to an end. The very forces that created this nightmare world contained the seeds of their own destruction, and when that collapse finally came, it would reshape life on Earth in ways that still echo today. But that's a story for our next chapter, where we'll explore how this age of giants finally crumbled and what rose from its ashes to inherit the Earth. But before we witness that collapse, we need to understand just how completely these arthropod giants dominated their world. Because what happened during the Carboniferous wasn't just a case of insects getting bigger, it was a complete restructuring of life's hierarchy, where creatures we now consider insignificant became the apex predators of their time. To truly grasp this, you have to abandon everything you think you know about the food chain. Today, when we imagine deadly predators, we picture lions, sharks, or bears, massive vertebrates with powerful muscles, sharp teeth, and hunting strategies honed over millions of years. But during the Carboniferous, the most feared hunters on land had jointed legs, compound eyes, and exoskeletons that gleamed like armor in the filtered sunlight. These weren't just oversized versions of modern insects. They were evolutionary masterpieces, perfectly adapted to exploit their oxygen-rich environment. Take Arthropleura, the giant millipede that could stretch longer than a modern alligator. This wasn't some sluggish scavenger picking through dead leaves. Fossil evidence suggests these creatures moved with surprising speed and coordination, their hundreds of legs working in perfect synchronization as they navigated the dense undergrowth. The sound alone would have been terrifying. Imagine lying still in the darkness of a Carboniferous swamp and hearing the approaching scrape of armored segments dragging across fallen logs, the rhythmic clicking of countless legs finding purchase on wet stone. Even when these giants passed without incident, their presence left an impression of weight and inevitability that would haunt any creature unlucky enough to witness it. And Arthropleura wasn't hunting alone. The forest floor was a maze of predators, each filling a different niche in this alien ecosystem. Giant scorpions patrolled the shadows with pincers that could snap through the shells of early amphibians. Their tails, arched overhead like question marks tipped with death, delivered venom potent enough to paralyze creatures many times their own size. Meanwhile, the canopy belonged to hunters even more terrifying than those on the ground. Meganeuropsis, the giant dragonfly whose wings could span nearly 3 feet, ruled the airways with an efficiency that modern fighter pilots would envy. These weren't the delicate creatures we see skimming over modern ponds. They were aerial predators with reflexes lightning fast enough to snatch birds from the air, and compound eyes that could track movement across vast distances. The hunting techniques of these creatures were sophisticated beyond anything we might expect from insects. Meganeuropsis didn't just rely on brute force. It used precision strikes, swooping down from above to catch prey in its spiny legs before carrying them to feeding perches high in the canopy. The sound of its wings created a deep, thrumming buzz that carried across the swamplands like a warning siren announcing to everything below that death was approaching from above. But perhaps most unsettling of all were the spiders. In our modern world, we might feel a momentary chill at the sight of a large spider in the corner of a room. During the Carboniferous, that reaction would have been magnified into pure terror. These weren't creatures that scuttled away when discovered. They were confident predators that had no reason to fear anything else in their environment. Picture webs stretching between massive tree ferns, not the delicate constructions we know today, but industrial-strength nets capable of stopping a running animal in its tracks. The spiders that built them were patient hunters with 8 eyes perfectly adapted to detect the slightest vibration in their silk. Once something became entangled, escape was virtually impossible. The prey would struggle briefly before venom took effect, and then the forest would return to its oppressive quiet. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Carboniferous life. The sheer density of predators made the landscape feel claustrophobic in a way that's almost impossible to imagine today. Modern ecosystems, even dangerous ones, have breathing room. A hiker in grizzly country might encounter one bear in a week of wilderness travel. A swimmer in shark-infested waters faces a statistical chance of attack measured in millions to 1. But in the Carboniferous swamps, predators weren't statistical possibilities. They were everywhere, all the time. The forest floor crawled with armored hunters. The canopy buzzed with aerial predators. Every shadow could conceal something waiting to strike. There was no safe moment, no relaxation, no peace. For the early amphibians trying to exploit this hostile environment, survival required a completely different set of skills than anything we can relate to today. Stealth became more important than speed. The ability to remain motionless for hours outweighed the need for aggressive hunting. Most critically, knowing when to retreat to the water wasn't just tactical knowledge, it was the difference between life and death. These amphibians developed behavioral patterns that seem almost paranoid by modern standards, but made perfect sense in their world. They moved primarily during brief windows when predator activity was reduced. They stuck close to water sources, never venturing more than a few desperate bounds from safety. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether an area was actively patrolled by arthropod hunters. And they discovered something remarkable. The very creatures that made land so dangerous had a crucial weakness. Despite their size and ferocity, these giant arthropods were fundamentally limited by their biology. Their breathing systems, perfectly adapted for the oxygen-rich air, became liabilities in aquatic environments. Their heavy exoskeletons, which provided excellent protection on land, made them clumsy and inefficient in water. This created invisible boundaries throughout the Carboniferous landscape. Streams, ponds, and shallow lakes became sanctuaries where the rules of engagement completely changed. A giant dragonfly that could terrorize an entire forest clearing was helpless once its prey disappeared beneath the surface. A scorpion the size of a house cat, perfectly capable of crushing anything it caught on land, couldn't effectively hunt in water deeper than a few inches. The early amphibians exploited these boundaries with increasing sophistication. They developed what we might call an aquatic escape strategy, always keeping mental maps of the nearest water sources and practicing rapid retreats until they became second nature. When danger approached, they didn't try to fight or hide. They dove. This lifestyle created evolutionary pressures unlike anything seen before or since. Amphibians that could hold their breath longer survived to reproduce. those with more powerful swimming strokes could escape predators that others couldn't. Most importantly, individuals that could accurately judge when to abandon land for water passed on their caution to the next generation. Over millions of years, this constant pressure shaped not just behavior, but biology itself. Amphibian skin became more permeable, allowing for better gas exchange underwater. Their limbs developed the dual capability needed for both terrestrial locomotion and aquatic escape. Their nervous systems became hyper-tuned to detect the approach of arthropod predators, creating reflexes so sharp they bordered on prescient. But perhaps the most significant development was psychological. These early vertebrates developed what we might recognize as a deep, instinctive wariness of terrestrial environments. They learned to associate solid ground with danger and water with safety. This wasn't a conscious decision, but an evolutionary adaptation encoded in their genes and passed down through countless generations. And here's where our story takes on truly profound implications. Because those early amphibians, cowering in Carboniferous swamps and fleeing to water whenever giant arthropods appeared, were our ancestors. The fears they developed, the survival strategies they perfected, and the deep-seated preference for water as sanctuary became part of our evolutionary inheritance. Even today, hundreds of millions of years later, we carry echoes of those ancient terrors. The instinctive revulsion many people feel toward large spiders or centipedes isn't just cultural learning. It's genetic memory, carved into our nervous systems by ancestors who lived in genuine terror of creatures that could kill them with ease. The way children naturally gravitate toward water play, the deep relaxation many adults feel when floating in pools or lakes, even our species' remarkable swimming abilities compared to other primates, all trace back to those desperate times when water meant survival and land meant death. But the Carboniferous giants had another, even more lasting impact on Earth's future. Their very dominance was setting up the conditions for their own destruction, and in that destruction lay the seeds of everything that would follow. The first warning signs came from the atmosphere itself. Those towering forests that had pumped oxygen into the sky at unprecedented rates were beginning to show cracks in their foundation. The same swampy conditions that had created this oxygen-rich paradise were slowly shifting, and with them the delicate balance that had allowed giants to rule the earth. Climate patterns across the planet started to change in subtle but devastating ways. The endless rains that had fed the massive swamp forests began to falter. Temperatures fluctuated wildly. Most critically, the carbon cycle that had locked away so much carbon dioxide and buried plant matter was reaching a tipping point. As the great forests began to wither and die, they stopped producing oxygen at their previous incredible rates. Meanwhile, volcanic activity was pumping more carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The balance that had maintained those lethal 35% oxygen levels started to tip back towards something closer to what we know today. For the arthropod giants, this shift spelled doom. Remember, their massive size was entirely dependent on that oxygen-rich air. Their primitive breathing systems, which had seemed like such an advantage when oxygen was abundant, became death sentences as levels began to fall. The decline wasn't immediate. It took thousands of years, which might seem gradual, but in evolutionary terms, this was catastrophically fast. Creatures that had ruled unchallenged for millions of years suddenly found their bodies failing them. The giant dragonflies that had terrorized the skies began struggling to maintain flight. Massive millipedes found their muscles starving for oxygen. Oversized scorpions became sluggish and vulnerable. But here's what makes this collapse so fascinating from our perspective. While the arthropod titans were suffocating in the changing atmosphere, other creatures were quietly positioning themselves to inherit the earth. And the most successful of these inheritors were the very amphibians that had spent millions of years cowering in terror, using water as their refuge from the monsters above. During those long ages of arthropod dominance, evolution hadn't been idle. The constant pressure of surviving in such a hostile environment had been forging amphibians into something new, something better adapted to exploit changing conditions. Their descendants, the early reptiles, carried innovations that would prove revolutionary. The most important of these innovations was the amniotic egg. While amphibians were still tied to water for reproduction, reptiles had evolved eggs that carried their own water supply, enclosed in protective shells. This might seem like a small change, but it was actually one of the most significant evolutionary breakthroughs in Earth's history. For the first time, vertebrates could reproduce without returning to aquatic environments. They could spread into areas that had been completely off-limits to their amphibian ancestors. Most importantly, they could exploit the ecological vacuum being left behind as the arthropod giants began their inexorable decline. These early reptiles were still small, cautious creatures, nothing like the mighty dinosaurs that would eventually follow. But they possessed something the dying giants lacked: adaptability. Their lungs were more efficient than the simple tube systems of arthropods. Their metabolisms could adjust to changing atmospheric conditions. Their behavioral flexibility allowed them to exploit new opportunities as they arose. As oxygen levels continued to fall, the disparity became more and more pronounced. Arthropods that had once grown to the size of coffee tables found themselves limited to dimensions we'd recognize today. The giant dragonflies with their hawk-like wingspans shrank back to familiar proportions. Massive centipedes dwindled to the sizes we might find hiding under logs in modern forests. Meanwhile, the reptiles were expanding into every niche the giants had abandoned. They climbed trees that had once been patrolled by enormous spiders. They hunted in clearings that had been the exclusive domain of cat-sized scorpions. They spread across landscapes that had been too dangerous for any vertebrate to explore. This transition wasn't peaceful. For thousands of years, the planet was caught in a state of ecological chaos. Old food webs collapsed as their apex predators vanished. New relationships formed between species that had never interacted before. Entire ecosystems restructured themselves around different rules of predation and survival. But from the perspective of those early vertebrates, the most significant change was psychological. For the first time in millions of years, land was becoming survivable. The oppressive weight of constant predation was lifting. Water was no longer the only sanctuary from terrestrial nightmares. This shift had profound implications that extended far beyond simple survival. The amphibians and reptiles that had learned to fear every shadow, to flee at the first sign of movement, to seek refuge underwater whenever danger approached, were suddenly finding themselves with options they'd never had before. Some lineages maintained their water-focused survival strategies, and these became the ancestors of modern amphibians, who still return to aquatic environments for reproduction and safety. But others began to explore the possibilities of a terrestrial lifestyle that wasn't dominated by constant terror. These pioneering reptiles developed new behaviors, new hunting strategies, and new social structures. They learned to exploit food sources that had been off-limits when giant arthropods controlled every aspect of terrestrial life. They began to occupy ecological niches that had been empty for millions of years. Most importantly, they started to grow larger themselves. With the atmospheric oxygen still elevated compared to modern levels, and with the competitive pressure from arthropod giants finally removed, reptiles began an evolutionary arms race of their own. Each generation pushed the boundaries of what was possible in terms of size, strength, and territorial control. The forests themselves were changing too. The death of the great swamplands had created new types of environments, drier and more open than the claustrophobic mazes that had characterized the Carboniferous world. These new landscapes favored different survival strategies, ones that emphasized mobility over hiding, active hunting over passive defense. In these transformed ecosystems, the old rules no longer applied. Water was still important, but it was no longer the ultimate sanctuary it had once been. Land was still dangerous, but the dangers were more manageable, more predictable. For the first time since vertebrates had begun exploring terrestrial environments, survival didn't depend entirely on knowing where the nearest pond or stream could be found. The descendants of those terrified amphibians were becoming something new, confident terrestrial predators in their own right. They were developing the characteristics that would eventually lead to the rise of dinosaurs. Those magnificent reptiles that would dominate Earth for the next 160 million years. But this transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without setbacks. The collapse of the Carboniferous world had created opportunities, but it had also created new challenges. As reptiles grew larger and more diverse, they began competing with each other for resources and territory. The simple dynamic of vertebrates versus arthropods was replaced by complex webs of predation and competition between different reptilian lineages. Some of these early reptiles specialized in hunting the remaining large arthropods, developing jaws powerful enough to crack through their armored exoskeletons. Others focused on exploiting the plant resources that were becoming more accessible as giant herbivorous arthropods disappeared. Still others became generalists, adapting to whatever food sources and environmental conditions they encountered. The most successful of these reptilian pioneers were those that could balance terrestrial competence with aquatic capability. While they were no longer dependent on water for survival, those lineages that maintained swimming abilities and comfort in aquatic environments had access to resources and refugia that purely terrestrial species lacked. This balance between land and water would become one of the defining characteristics of early reptilian success. Unlike their amphibian ancestors, who had been forced to choose between terrestrial opportunity and aquatic safety, these new reptiles could exploit both environments as conditions demanded. The transformation was so complete that within a few million years, the entire character of life on Earth had been revolutionized. The age when water was safer than land was drawing to a close, replaced by a new era where terrestrial environments offered their own forms of safety and opportunity. Yet the legacy of that extraordinary time lived on in ways both obvious and subtle. The evolutionary innovations that had been forged in the crucible of arthropod terror became the foundation for everything that followed. The behavioral patterns that had been carved into vertebrate nervous systems by millions of years of aquatic refuge-seeking influenced how reptiles, and eventually mammals and birds, would interact with their environments. Even today we can see echoes of those ancient survival strategies in how modern animals behave around water sources, how they evaluate terrestrial versus aquatic threats, and how they balance the opportunities and dangers of different habitats. The Carboniferous period had been Earth's great experiment in atmospheric extremes, and the results had been both magnificent and terrifying. But as that experiment wound down and atmospheric chemistry returned to more familiar proportions, life was preparing for its next great adventure, the age of reptiles, and eventually the rise of creatures that would dwarf even the arthropod giants in size and power. But the story of the Carboniferous collapse reveals something even more profound about the nature of life itself. Because what happened next would set the stage for a pattern that has repeated itself throughout Earth's history. The rise, dominance, and fall of entire biological empires, each one paving the way for something completely different to take its place. As the giant arthropods faded into evolutionary obscurity, their disappearance created what scientists call an ecological release. Imagine a dam busting, but instead of water flooding the landscape, it was opportunity. Niches that had been locked away for millions of years suddenly became available. Food sources that had been guarded by massive predators were up for grabs. Territories that had been too dangerous to explore became accessible. The early reptiles that inherited this transformed world faced challenges their amphibian ancestors could never have imagined. Success was no longer about finding the quickest route to water when danger approached. Instead, it was about competing with other vertebrates for the first time in their evolutionary history. This competition drove innovation at a pace that was breathtaking by geological standards. Within just a few million years, reptiles had diversified into forms that exploited nearly every available ecological niche. Some became swift hunters, chasing down prey across the increasingly open landscapes. Others became ambush predators, lurking in the shadows of the new forest types that were replacing the ancient swamplands. Most remarkably, some lineages began experimenting with size in ways that would have been impossible when giant arthropods dominated the landscape. These early experiments in reptilian gigantism were modest by later standards, but they represented a fundamental shift in who could claim the largest body sizes on land. The atmospheric changes that had doomed the arthropod giants were actually beneficial for these expanding reptiles. Their more efficient respiratory systems could extract oxygen from air that was becoming less concentrated, giving them a competitive advantage over creatures that relied on simple diffusion. Their four-chambered hearts could pump blood more effectively, supporting larger body sizes and more active lifestyles. But perhaps most importantly, these reptiles were developing something that the arthropods had never possessed: behavioral complexity. Where giant insects had operated largely on instinct, reptiles began showing signs of learning, memory, and even primitive problem-solving abilities. This cognitive flexibility would prove to be one of their greatest assets as they navigated an increasingly complex world. The transformation of terrestrial ecosystems was so thorough that it's difficult for us to imagine how different things had become. The claustrophobic swamp forests, with their towering tree ferns and club mosses, were giving way to more diverse plant communities. Conifers, the ancestors of modern pine and spruce trees, were beginning to colonize drier upland areas. Seed plants were experimenting with new reproductive strategies that didn't require the constant moisture that earlier plants had demanded. These changes in plant communities had cascading effects throughout the food web. Herbivorous insects, no longer able to grow to enormous sizes, had to develop new strategies for processing plant material. Some became more specialized, focusing on specific plant parts or chemical compounds. Others remained generalists, but formed large colonies that could collectively process the same amount of vegetation that a single giant had once consumed. The predators that hunted these smaller herbivores also had to adapt. The days when a single giant spider could control an entire section of forest were over. Instead, predation became a more distributed affair, with multiple smaller predators sharing territories and prey resources. For the reptiles expanding into this transformed landscape, these changes represented unprecedented opportunities. They could hunt the abundant smaller arthropods without fear of retaliation from giant relatives. They could explore forest areas that had been inaccessible when every tree might harbor a massive web or lurking scorpion. Most importantly, they could begin to establish their own territorial claims without having to defer to creatures that outweighed them by orders of magnitude. This territorial expansion had profound implications for reptilian social evolution. For the first time, these creatures could afford to be conspicuous. They could engage in territorial displays, compete openly for mates, and even cooperate with others of their kind without constantly watching for arthropod predators. Some lineages began developing elaborate social behaviors that would have been suicidal during the height of arthropod dominance. They established communal nesting sites, engaged in group hunting strategies, and even showed early forms of parental care. These behaviors, which seem natural to us now, represented revolutionary adaptations to a world where survival no longer depended entirely on remaining hidden and ready to flee to water at a moment's notice. The psychological liberation that came with this ecological release cannot be overstated. Imagine spending your entire evolutionary history as prey, constantly looking over your shoulder, always ready to dive for cover. Then imagine suddenly discovering that the predators that had shaped every aspect of your behavior were gone, replaced by competitors you could actually face on equal terms. This shift from prey mentality to competitive mentality was perhaps the most significant change in vertebrate psychology since the first fish had developed jaws. It opened up behavioral possibilities that had been impossible for millions of years, and reptiles began exploring these possibilities with remarkable creativity. Some lineages developed elaborate courtship rituals, engaging in displays that would have attracted every giant predator within miles during the Carboniferous. Others began experimenting with different hunting strategies, moving from the cautious, opportunistic feeding that had characterized their ancestors to more active and aggressive predation. The most successful of these early reptilian pioneers were those that could balance this new behavioral freedom with the survival wisdom that had been hard-won during the age of arthropod giants. They retained their ancestors' keen awareness of environmental dangers while developing new capabilities for exploiting terrestrial opportunities. This balance would prove crucial as reptiles continued to diversify and grow larger. The world they were inheriting was not without its dangers, but these were dangers they could understand and potentially overcome through size, strength, and intelligence. No longer were they facing predators so alien and overwhelming that the only rational response was to flee to the nearest body of water. As reptilian lineages continued to evolve and specialize, some began developing characteristics that would eventually lead to the most successful vertebrate dynasty in Earth's history. These early innovations included more efficient metabolism, improved temperature regulation, and increasingly sophisticated neural structures that supported complex behaviors. The stage was being set for creatures that would eventually dwarf even the largest Carboniferous arthropods. But unlike those ancient giants, whose success had been built on exploiting a temporary atmospheric anomaly, the reptiles were developing adaptations that would prove remarkably durable across changing environmental conditions. The descendants of those terrified amphibians, who had spent millions of years using water as their sanctuary from terrestrial nightmares, were becoming the architects of a new kind of terrestrial dominance, one based not on atmospheric chemistry, but on biological innovation, behavioral complexity, and the kind of adaptive flexibility that could survive whatever changes the future might bring. This transformation was so complete that within relatively few geological periods, the very idea that water had once been safer than land would have seemed absurd to any observer. The terrestrial environment had been reclaimed by vertebrates, and they were making it their own in ways that would have been unimaginable during the dark ages of arthropod terror. Yet the memory of those times lived on, encoded in the deepest structures of vertebrate nervous systems. The fear responses that had kept amphibians alive in a world of giant predators became the foundation for more sophisticated threat assessment systems. The aquatic escape strategies that had been matters of life and death evolved into the swimming abilities that many reptiles maintained even as they became fully terrestrial. Most importantly, the ecological wisdom that had been gained through millions of years of living as prey in a predator-dominated world, became the foundation for understanding how ecosystems function. The reptiles that inherited the post-Carboniferous world carried with them an intuitive understanding of predator-prey relationships, territorial dynamics, and environmental resource management that had been forged in the most intense school of survival imaginable. As we look back at this extraordinary chapter in Earth's history, we begin to see how the age when water was safer than land was not just a bizarre anomaly, but a crucial formative period that shaped everything that followed. The innovations, adaptations, and survival strategies that were developed during those terrifying times became the building blocks for all subsequent vertebrate success. The reptiles that emerged from this crucible were not just survivors, but inheritors of a vast store of evolutionary wisdom. They carried within their genes and nervous systems the accumulated knowledge of what it meant to live in a truly dangerous world, and how to not just survive, but eventually thrive in the face of seemingly impossible odds. This knowledge would serve them well, because the story of life on Earth was far from over. The collapse of the Carboniferous world was just the first of many great transitions that would reshape the planet's ecosystems. Each of these transitions would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new tests of the adaptive strategies that had been forged in those ancient swamps, where water truly was the only sanctuary from the monsters that ruled the land. And so we arrive at one of the most profound chapters in our planet's story, where the very foundations of life were about to be tested in ways that would make the Carboniferous period look like a gentle prelude. But before we dive into that cataclysm, we need to understand something crucial about the world that was emerging from the ashes of the arthropod empire. The early reptiles weren't just inheriting empty real estate. They were stepping into ecosystems that were fundamentally broken, food webs that had been shattered by the collapse of creatures that had defined the rules of survival for millions of years. Imagine a city where all the traffic lights suddenly stopped working, where every familiar landmark had been torn down overnight, where the very streets themselves had been rearranged. That was the biological landscape these pioneering vertebrates faced. But here's what makes their story so remarkable. Instead of being paralyzed by this chaos, they embraced it. Evolution, it turns out, loves a vacuum, and the ecological vacuum left by the dying arthropod giants was about to be filled in ways that would reshape the entire trajectory of life on Earth. The first thing these expanding reptiles had to learn was how to be predators in their own right. For millions of years, their ancestors had perfected the art of being prey. Every instinct, every reflex, every behavioral pattern had been honed around one central principle: avoid being eaten by something larger and more dangerous than yourself. Now, suddenly, they were discovering that they could be the dangerous ones. This transition from prey to predator wasn't just about growing bigger teeth or stronger muscles. It was about rewiring millions of years of evolutionary programming. Think about what that means. These creatures had to overcome instincts so deeply embedded that they were basically genetic law. The urge to flee to water when threatened, the compulsion to hide rather than confront, the assumption that anything larger than yourself was automatically a mortal enemy. Some lineages never made this transition successfully. They remained locked in the behavioral patterns that had served their ancestors well, but were poorly suited to a world where vertebrates could actually compete for dominance. These conservative lineages became the ancestors of modern amphibians, still tied to water, still operating under survival strategies that were forged in the age of giant arthropods. But the most successful reptilian pioneers did something extraordinary. They kept the survival wisdom their ancestors had earned through terror, while developing entirely new capabilities for aggression and territorial control. They became the first vertebrates to truly master the art of being both predator and prey, depending on the situation. This dual mastery gave them incredible flexibility as they spread into the transformed landscapes of the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods. They could hunt smaller creatures with the patience and stealth their ancestors had used to avoid giant scorpions. But they could also stand their ground against competitors, using size and strength in ways that would have been suicidal when cat-sized arachnids ruled the forest floor. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. For the first time in vertebrate history, these creatures were discovering what it felt like to be confident on land, not just surviving, not just hiding, but actually owning territory and defending it successfully against challengers. This confidence bred innovation at a rate that was staggering by evolutionary standards. Within just a few million years, reptiles had developed hunting strategies that ranged from pack cooperation to solitary ambush predation. They experimented with different body plans, from the sleek and swift to the heavily armored. Most importantly, they began pushing the boundaries of size in ways that their amphibian ancestors could never have imagined. But as these reptiles grew larger and more diverse, they were unknowingly setting the stage for changes that would dwarf even the collapse of the arthropod giants. The atmospheric conditions that had made the Carboniferous possible were continuing to shift, and those shifts were accelerating toward something unprecedented in Earth's history. The oxygen levels that had sustained giant insects were dropping steadily, but that was just the beginning. Carbon dioxide levels were starting to rise as volcanic activity increased across the globe. Temperatures were fluctuating wildly. Most ominously, the delicate balance of gases that had supported life for millions of years was approaching a tipping point that would make the Carboniferous collapse look like a gentle transition. What was coming would be the closest Earth had ever come to becoming a completely lifeless planet, an extinction event so severe that it would eliminate over 90% of all species, both on land and in the oceans, that had once served as sanctuary from terrestrial nightmares. The great dying was approaching, and when it arrived, it would test every survival strategy that life had ever developed. But that's exactly what makes our story so compelling. Because the reptiles that were just beginning to flourish in the post-Carboniferous world were about to face the ultimate test of the survival wisdom they had inherited from their water-seeking ancestors. The skills that had been forged in terror were about to be tested in ways that would determine whether complex life could survive on Earth at all. The early warning signs were subtle at first, slight changes in plant communities as different species responded to shifting atmospheric chemistry, fluctuations in insect populations as smaller arthropods struggled to adapt to changing conditions, gradual shifts in weather patterns that affected everything from reproduction cycles to migration routes. But beneath these surface changes, something far more sinister was building. Deep within the earth, volcanic systems were beginning to stir in ways that hadn't been seen for hundreds of millions of years. The Siberian Traps, a volcanic province that would eventually cover an area larger than most countries, were preparing to unleash forces that would fundamentally alter the chemistry of both the atmosphere and the oceans. The reptiles expanding across the changing landscapes had no way of knowing what was coming. How could they? The scale of what was approaching was beyond anything in their evolutionary experience. The arthropod giants had been local predators, terrifying but comprehensible. The climate changes that had ended their reign had been gradual enough for life to adapt and evolve new strategies. What was building toward Earth was something entirely different, a planetary catastrophe that would make the transition from water sanctuary to land opportunity look like a minor adjustment. The Great Dying would test not just individual survival, but the very possibility of complex life continuing to exist. Yet, in this approaching darkness lay hidden seeds of hope, because the reptiles that would face this ultimate challenge carried within them something that no previous dominant life forms had possessed. They carried the accumulated wisdom of creatures that had survived when water was safer than land, who had learned to read environmental dangers with precision, who had mastered the art of finding refuge when the world itself turned hostile. The survival strategies that had been forged in Carboniferous swamps, under the shadow of giant predators, in the desperate search for aquatic sanctuary, were about to be tested on a scale that would determine the future of life itself. And in that test, we would discover whether the lessons learned during Earth's most alien age were powerful enough to carry life through its darkest hour. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between life and extinction, between the survival wisdom earned through millions of years of terror and forces that threatened to end the story of complex life forever. What happened next would determine not just which creatures survived, but whether there would be any survivors at all. And in that approaching catastrophe, we find the final answer to why the age when water was safer than land matters so much to our understanding of life's resilience. Because the creatures that learned to seek sanctuary in ancient waters were about to discover whether any sanctuary could protect them from a planet that was preparing to become hostile to life itself. The Great Dying was coming, and with it, the ultimate test of everything that evolution had learned about survival in impossible circumstances. But before that ultimate catastrophe arrived, there was still time for one final chapter in the strange story of terrestrial transformation. The reptiles that had emerged from the shadow of arthropod terror were about to experience something their ancestors could never have imagined. A golden age of vertebrate expansion that would set the template for everything that followed. Picture the world as it existed In those final millennia before the Great Dying, the oppressive swamp forests of the Carboniferous had given way to landscapes that were simultaneously familiar and alien. Vast plains stretched between scattered groves of early conifers. River systems carved through terrain that was no longer choked with the endless tangle of giant ferns and club mosses. For the first time in Earth's history, you could stand on solid ground and actually see the horizon. This openness was revolutionary in ways that we can barely comprehend. Remember, for millions of years, terrestrial life had been defined by claustrophobia, dense canopies that blocked out the sun, undergrowth so thick that visibility was measured in feet rather than miles. Every journey across land was a navigation through maze-like corridors where death could lurk behind any tree trunk or fallen log. Now, suddenly, there was space, room to run, to chase, to engage in behaviors that would have been impossible when giant spiders turned every clearing into a web-strung death trap. The psychological impact of this environmental opening was profound, and reptiles responded to it with an explosion of evolutionary creativity that would reshape the rules of terrestrial life. The first and most obvious change was in hunting strategies. When your ancestors spent millions of years perfecting the art of stealth, of moving without making a sound, of striking from hiding and disappearing before retaliation was possible, you inherit those skills as part of your basic behavioral toolkit. But now, these skills could be combined with something entirely new: the ability to pursue prey across open ground. Some reptilian lineages became persistence hunters, using their inherited patience and endurance to wear down prey over distances that would have been unimaginable in the closed forests of the past. Others developed into ambush specialists, but instead of hiding from giant predators, they were hiding from prey, using their ancestors' stealth abilities for offensive rather than defensive purposes. The most successful hunters learned to combine both strategies, switching between active pursuit and patient ambush, depending on the situation. This behavioral flexibility gave them enormous advantages as they spread into the diverse new environments that were opening up across the planet. But hunting was just the beginning. The real revolution came in social behavior, when survival depends on being able to disappear into water at a moment's notice. You can't afford to form large groups or engage in complex social interactions. Every gathering of individuals increases the chance of detection by giant predators. Every social behavior that requires time and attention is a potentially fatal distraction from the constant vigilance that survival demands. With the arthropod giants gone, these constraints disappeared almost overnight. Reptiles began experimenting with social structures that ranged from simple pair bonding to complex hierarchical groups. They developed communication systems that would have been suicidal in a world where every sound might attract the attention of a cat-sized scorpion. Some lineages discovered the advantages of cooperative hunting, working together to bring down prey that would have been impossible for any individual to handle. Others found that group living provided protection against the remaining predators, with multiple pairs of eyes and ears, making it much harder for any threat to approach undetected. The most innovative social behaviors emerged among reptiles that learned to balance cooperation with competition. These creatures developed elaborate dominance displays, territorial rituals, and mating competitions that turned survival skills into social tools. The patience that had once been used to wait motionless while giant predators passed by was repurposed into the ability to outlast rivals in territorial standoffs. The stealth abilities that had been essential for avoiding detection became tools for social manipulation, allowing individuals to approach potential mates or competitors without triggering aggressive responses. The quick reflexes that had meant the difference between escape and death in Carboniferous swamps were transformed into lightning-fast responses in social confrontations. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what we might recognize as primitive culture. Some reptilian groups began passing learned behaviors from one generation to the next, teaching their offspring not just basic survival skills, but sophisticated knowledge about territory, prey behavior, and environmental patterns. This cultural transmission was possible because, for the first time in vertebrate history, parents could afford to spend extended time with their young without constantly scanning for giant predators. They could engage in teaching behaviors, demonstrate hunting techniques, and share knowledge about safe routes and dangerous areas. The implications of this cultural evolution were staggering. Instead of each generation having to rediscover survival strategies through trial and error, young reptiles could inherit the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. This dramatically accelerated the pace of behavioral innovation and allowed successful strategies to spread much more rapidly through populations. Some groups developed sophisticated mental maps of their territories, passed down through generations and constantly updated with new information about resources, dangers, and opportunities. Others created what amounted to primitive tool use, learning to manipulate their environment in ways that improved hunting success or territory defense. The most advanced lineages began showing signs of what we might call proto-intelligence, the ability to solve novel problems, adapt to changing circumstances, and even anticipate future challenges based on past experience. These cognitive abilities would prove crucial as environmental conditions continued to shift toward the coming catastrophe. All of this innovation was happening against a backdrop of continued atmospheric change. The oxygen levels that had made arthropod gigantism possible were continuing to decline, but they were still higher than modern levels. This gave the expanding reptiles access to energy levels that supported larger body sizes and more active lifestyles than anything their amphibian ancestors could have achieved. At the same time, rising carbon dioxide levels were beginning to create a greenhouse effect that warmed global temperatures and altered weather patterns. These changes were gradual enough that life could adapt, but they were laying the groundwork for the much more dramatic shifts that were approaching. The reptiles spreading across this transforming world were becoming larger, more diverse, and more ecologically dominant with each passing generation. Some lineages specialized in hunting the remaining large arthropods, developing powerful jaws and crushing bites that could crack through even the most heavily armored exoskeletons. Others focused on the abundant smaller prey that filled niches previously occupied by giant herbivorous insects. The most successful groups learned to exploit multiple food sources, switching between different prey types as availability changed with seasons or environmental conditions. This dietary flexibility was another inheritance from their amphibian ancestors, who had been forced to take advantage of any feeding opportunity that didn't require exposing themselves to giant predators for extended periods. As these reptiles continued to grow and diversify, they began to approach sizes that rivaled some of the smaller arthropod giants of the past. But unlike those ancient predators, whose success had been entirely dependent on atmospheric chemistry, the reptiles were building their dominance on biological innovations that were much more resistant to environmental change. Their more efficient respiratory systems could extract oxygen from air that was becoming less concentrated. Their improved circulation could support larger body sizes even as atmospheric conditions shifted. Most importantly, their behavioral flexibility allowed them to adapt their strategies as circumstances changed, rather than being locked into patterns that only worked under specific conditions. This adaptability would prove to be their salvation, because the environmental changes that were approaching would test every survival strategy that life had ever developed. The gradual shifts in atmospheric chemistry were about to accelerate into something unprecedented in Earth's history. Deep beneath the surface, in what is now Siberia, volcanic systems were building toward an eruption that would dwarf anything in recorded history. These weren't ordinary volcanoes, but massive flood basalt provinces that would pour molten rock across areas the size of continents. The gases they would release would fundamentally alter the chemistry of both atmosphere and oceans. The early warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Plant communities that had been stable for millions of years were beginning to shift and collapse. Insect populations were fluctuating wildly as changing atmospheric chemistry affected their development and reproduction. Weather patterns were becoming increasingly erratic, with extreme temperatures and unpredictable precipitation. But the reptiles, expanding across these changing landscapes, carried within them something that no dominant life form had ever possessed before: the accumulated survival wisdom of creatures that had learned to read environmental dangers with extraordinary precision. Their ancestors had survived by developing an almost supernatural ability to detect threats and find sanctuary when the world became hostile. These skills, honed over millions of years of living in terror, were about to be tested on a planetary scale. The creatures that had learned to seek refuge in water when land became too dangerous were going to discover whether any refuge could protect them from a world that was preparing to become hostile to life itself. The volcanic systems building toward eruption would release gases that would poison the atmosphere, acids that would sterilize the oceans, and heat that would make vast areas of the planet uninhabitable. The survival strategies that had been forged in Carboniferous swamps were about to face the ultimate test. Would the behavioral flexibility that had allowed reptiles to exploit the post-arthropod world be enough to carry them through planetary catastrophe? Could the environmental awareness that had been carved into vertebrate nervous systems by millions of years of predator pressure help them navigate a world where the very air and water became toxic? The answers to these questions would determine not just which lineages survived, but whether complex life could continue to exist on Earth at all. The Great Dying was approaching, and with it, the final test of everything that evolution had learned about survival in impossible circumstances. The reptiles that had inherited the transformed world were about to discover whether the lessons learned during the age when water was safer than land were powerful enough to carry life through its darkest hour. Their success or failure would write the next chapter in Earth's story, determining whether the planet would remain a living world or join the ranks of dead planets circling through the cosmic void. And in that approaching test, we find the ultimate meaning of our strange story about giant arthropods and cowering amphibians, about atmospheric chemistry and evolutionary arms races, about the only time in history when diving underwater was the smartest thing any land animal could do. Because all of those ancient struggles, all of that accumulated wisdom about survival in hostile environments, all of those hard-won lessons about reading danger and finding sanctuary, were about to determine whether life itself would have a future on planet Earth. The Great Dying was no ordinary extinction. When we talk about mass extinctions today, we might imagine the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, a sudden cosmic impact that changed everything in an instant. But what approached Earth at the end of the Permian period was something far more insidious, far more complete, and far more terrifying in its implications. Picture the Siberian landscape as volcanic systems began their catastrophic awakening. This wasn't a single mountain exploding in dramatic fashion. Instead, vast networks of fissures opened across an area larger than most countries, pouring molten rock across the landscape in floods that would continue for thousands of years. The scale was beyond anything in human experience, beyond anything that complex life had ever faced. But the lava itself was just the beginning. With each eruption came clouds of gases that rose into the atmosphere like poison breath from the planet's core. Carbon dioxide poured out in quantities that dwarfed anything from the Carboniferous forests. Sulfur compounds that would turn rain into acid. Methane that would trap heat and send temperatures soaring. Most deadly of all, hydrogen sulfide, a gas so toxic that even small concentrations could kill most forms of life. As these gases spread through the atmosphere, they began transforming Earth into something unrecognizable. The climate that had supported the expansion of reptilian life started to collapse. Temperatures rose so high that vast areas became uninhabitable. Ocean chemistry changed as acids dissolved into seawater, creating conditions that were toxic to most marine life. The reptiles that had been flourishing in their post-arthropod world found themselves facing challenges that no amount of evolutionary adaptation could have prepared them for. The behavioral flexibility that had served them so well in territorial disputes and hunting strategies was useless against atmospheric chemistry that was becoming lethal to breathe. For creatures whose ancestors had learned to read environmental dangers with extraordinary precision. The signals were unmistakable. But unlike the giant scorpions and dragonflies that could be avoided through stealth and aquatic escape, this threat was everywhere at once. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, no sanctuary that could provide protection from a planet that was turning toxic. The first casualties were the specialists, those lineages that had become perfectly adapted to specific environmental conditions. As temperatures soared and atmospheric chemistry shifted, creatures that had thrived in particular habitats found their worlds disappearing around them. Forest-dwelling species watched their ecosystems wither and die. Aquatic specialists discovered that the water itself was becoming poisonous. Even the generalists, those adaptable survivors who had inherited the survival wisdom of their amphibian ancestors, found themselves pushed to the absolute limits of what life could endure. The environmental awareness that had been carved into their nervous systems by millions of years of predator pressure was screaming warnings, but there was nowhere safe to go. Some lineages tried to retreat to the strategies that had saved their ancestors during the age of arthropod terror. They sought out water sources, hoping that aquatic environments might provide the same sanctuary they had offered during the Carboniferous. But the great dying was different. The oceans themselves were becoming acidic graveyards where marine life was suffocating in waters that could no longer support the chemistry of life. So, the next time you feel that instinctive chill when a spider scurries across your floor, or that deep relaxation when you slip into warm water, remember that you're experiencing echoes from the only time in Earth's history when land was a nightmare and water was salvation. The Carboniferous period wasn't just a bizarre chapter in our planet's past. It was the crucible that forged the survival instincts we still carry today.